I'm MacKenzie Fegan, and this is 112BK. Coming up, the art of meditating and meditating on art. Museums are getting into the mindfulness game.
It seems to me that the museum becomes a sort of cultural arm of other entities that are using meditation for purposes that I don't think are so savory.
And then you're gonna die.
None of us are getting out of this thing alive. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day. I mean, what matters at the end of the day.
To a saffron-robed Buddhist monk, meditation is part of a spiritual practice devoted to the relinquishment of self-centered desire and materialism. But this is America, baby, and I can't sell that. Meditation is now a multi-million-dollar industry. The popular app Headspace alone is valued at $250 million, and everyone is hungry for a piece of that mindfulness pie. Museums are no exception, and our next guest wrote about this trend in a piece for the Baffler. It's called The Rise of the Mindful Museum. Michael Friedrich, welcome to 112BK.
Thanks for having me.
So you went to a few museums that are offering mindfulness or meditation sessions, including the MoMA. Tell me how you found out about this event.
So that's right. I cover art, and I get the newsletter from the museum, and my curiosity was piqued when I saw that they had this Quiet Mornings program, which is meditation, and they open their galleries at 7:30 a.m., that ungodly hour. And then there's a portion of guided meditation with a Buddhist practitioner. And I meditate in my life. I thought this was an interesting intersection, and I was determined to see what it was like. But my skepticism was also piqued by the fact that it was sponsored by this events promoter, Flavor Pill. So I wondered what that meant. And as I did research, I discovered that this is actually a phenomenon, that there are all sorts of art museums across the country that are including a mindfulness component to their programming.
And tell me about your own meditation practice. How did you come to that? Do you do it daily?
I go to a Buddhist teaching center in the Kadampa tradition every Sunday, and I came to that actually through trying to alleviate some of my own anxiety problems, and it's been helpful for that, and truly been effective at finding some kind of peace.
And when you go to this Buddhist center, what are they teaching you about meditation? What's the goal of meditating in this Buddhist tradition?
If you're meditating in a Buddhist tradition, the goal is enlightenment, ultimately. So it's a bit metaphysical and quite different from what we see, I think, in Western mindfulness practices today. It's part of what I was interested in looking at in the article.
How did that compare to the meditation session that you did at the MoMA?
What I've been interested in tracking is how meditation in the culture has gone from, as you say, being a spiritual and philosophical practice that is really focused on finding meaning and purpose in life to, in the last few decades in America, more of a medical or therapeutic practice through mindfulness. So at the MoMA, the programming they offered, I described this in the piece, there was a Mark Rothko piece projected in the background of this theater we sat in, darkened altogether, about 100 people. And there was an introduction by a couple of PR people, one from the MoMA and one from this company, Flavor Pill, that coordinates these sorts of events. And it was a lot of, kind of praise and applause and cheerleading for the MoMA's program. Then we had a brief teaching from this guide, Manoj Diaz, who is a finance professional turned meditator, who does kind of corporate meditation events. He has training and credentials in this, but it was quite basic. It was about awareness and focusing on the breath. He told a Buddhist parable, and that was fine. All told, the meditation itself was a nice introduction. And I think, what was curious about it is that in no way did it integrate the space of the museum, the artwork, even the Rothko that was presented there, or the exhibits that we'd been admitted to before the meditation. And it was kind of tagged with this follow-up from the PR person from Flavor Pill, who took the mic and admonished us to use loving kindness throughout our day. So also a fine thing to say, but to me it meant somehow that the MoMA itself was like deploying this concept for some purpose that I didn't wholly understand, that I wanted to.
So what do you think is the underlying problem to having museums and other cultural institutions hop on board the mindfulness bandwagon?
If it's introducing people to practices that are helpful to them and bring them peace, or introduce them to a more serious kind of meditation, I think that's wonderful. The problem for me is that, and what I write about at the Baffler, is that it seems to me that the museum becomes a sort of cultural arm of other entities that are using meditation for purposes that I don't think are so savory. And in the article, what I write about is that what we see is a more and more precarious work environment. And some of these mega tech companies like Google and LinkedIn and Apple maybe are expecting their employers to do more with less, to hustle much harder, to be on all the time and always responsive to email, say. And this produces extreme stress. And those same companies are buying bulk subscriptions of meditation apps like Headspace, or sponsoring meditation sessions and trainings within the workplace. So I think you have this strange phenomenon where, rather than addressing the workplace practices that are causing stress and the structural forces of late capitalism that demand that we do this kind of extreme and constant labor, you have these companies treating the problem themselves. And that's part of what I'm looking at, where at one time there was a spiritual and philosophical practice in meditation. Now you have this kind of solution-oriented intervention for anxiety and stress, which is really consistent with the neoliberal economic mood we live in.
I guess I wonder if you didn't have that space for employees to clear their mind, would employees burn out and therefore agitate for better working conditions and unions and paid time off?
Contradictions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Is meditation in a corporate context actually a way of subduing the worker and perpetuating capitalism as we know it?
I think it is. I think that's what I'm getting at. It's become this way to help workers cope so that they can be more productive.
You went to both the MoMA and the Rubin, also the Brooklyn Museum?
Mm-hmm.
And the Rubin is actually an Asian art museum and has a very robust collection, and also is quite sensitive to the cultures whose art it represents. So I'm wondering, did you feel any difference in the meditation that was led by the ex-financial services manager and the one that was at the Rubin Museum?
Yeah, I have to admit, I really responded well to the Rubin's program, and like you say, in a lot of ways, as a Himalayan art museum especially, they have the most legitimate claim on the practice. I thought, too, that it actually had an art object to focus on. There was this traditional ceremonial bowl used to melt yak butter, which was completely fascinating.
And was this a projection, or was this the actual
It was
object?
also a projection,
Okay.
And it was something we could go see after the
I mean, so
programming.
is our earthly existence, right? So
we live in a delusion, and that's the goal of meditation, is
Right.
to break that delusion.
So you have this projection of a bowl used to melt yak butter. And so you found this to be a deeper, more meditative experience than the previous session at MoMA?
It seemed more considered. It seemed more meaningful. I think it still fits into this broad trend in the sense that it's offering something and sort of slotting it into the rhythm of the workday. I don't fault the Rubin for that, but I think it's in keeping with the same pattern we're seeing.
Right. So we're kind of using mindfulness and meditation interchangeably, but I'm curious about whether this has been a very clever rebrand of meditation. Do you find that calling it mindfulness instead of meditation is just an attempt to sort of capture larger audiences or distance it from anti-materialistic values associated with Buddhism in order to bend mindfulness into capitalist structures?
In short, yes. And that's something I write about too. So it was imported. In a number of different ways. A meditative practice. It's mindfulness. The term and the practice is most closely associated with Jon Kabat-Zinn, who was a University of Massachusetts medical professor who developed mindfulness-based stress reduction method, which is something of a clinical practice. A lot of its goals are the same, and he himself was a Buddhist-trained practitioner. But in his writings, he's sort of stripped it of the metaphysical characteristics, things like past lives, things like karma. So it's become this sort of secular enlightenment is what I write about. And it's also allowed some of these capitalist structures to adopt it without having to contend with more anti-materialist philosophies.
Right. In addition to corporations incorporating mindfulness practices into the benefits that they offer their employees, the military and police in certain states or countries have also started to adopt meditation and mindfulness. Can you talk a little bit about that and any cause for concern there?
So that's something I came across in my research also, is that a lot of law enforcement agencies and even some branches of the military have begun at least piloting meditation trainings. And so I think that's a really interesting piece of this when you think about the museum as a sort of cultural arm using mindfulness to produce a docile populace. And when you think of owners of capital like Google doing the same, well, now you also have more repressive forces of the state who are interested in or charged with maintaining the power of the state. And they're also using mindfulness. What I think is really interesting is, these are police and the military are the forces of violence. And they're also confronted with a lot of violence. Police, at least, face, I believe, the highest rates of suicide, alcoholism, and divorce of any profession. So these are people who face extreme professional stress. And again, what you have here is, rather than us examining the forces that are producing that kind of stress, the structural forces that require guardians, violent guardians of the state, we have this training intervention that simply reduces their anxiety. Now, if that helps police not to hurt themselves or hurt unarmed people of color, that's a net good. But I also think it's a clever way of eliding the structural problem.
Yeah, it seems like there is this tension where it's like the individual absolutely can be helped by meditation and mindfulness, and the positive health effects have been proven. But at the same time, if it just acts as some sort of like cultural soma that prevents people from challenging larger structures, maybe we should be examining that.
I think that's a nice way of putting it.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. Appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for having me. Good to be here.